At precisely 4:55 p.m. on the afternoon of Tuesday, November 10th, 1992, a single maple leaf, brittle and the color of dried blood, broke free from its branch and spiraled down onto the rain-slicked pavement of Main Street in Havenwood, New York. The air, thick with the scent of wood smoke and decaying foliage, held the damp, bone-deep chill that promised an early and unforgiving winter. Inside the Havenwood Public Library, a sanctuary of warm, yellow light and the quiet reverence of aging paper, 17-year-old Amelia Cartwright, known to everyone who loved her as Amy, slid a copy of Ray Bradbury's Something Wicked This Way Comes back into its rightful place on the shelf. The final task of her shift, the clock on the wall, a heavy oak piece that had marked the town's quiet hours for half a century, began its slow, mechanical preparation to strike 5. Amy, a girl whose life was a study in gentle reliability, a straight A student with a fondness for poetry and a future that seemed as clear and bright as a Hudson Valley autumn morning, pulled on her worn denim jacket, the collar frayed from years of comfortable use. She said her goodbyes to Mrs. Gable, the town librarian, a woman whose own life was an open book of quiet routines and silver-rimmed spectacles, and stepped out into the dying light of that Tuesday afternoon. The walk home was short, no more than 12 minutes at a brisk pace, a journey she had made thousands of times. It would take her past Finch's hardware, its windows filled with scarecrows and bags of rock salt for the coming ice, past the old movie theater whose marquee promised a weekend showing of a film she would never see, and finally up the gentle slope of Elm Street to the small, blue-shuttered house where a pot of her mother's beef stew was simmering on the stove, a beacon of warmth against the encroaching cold. The streetlights flickered on, casting long, distorted shadows that danced between the skeletal branches of the elm trees. The world was holding its breath, poised on the precipice of night. Amelia Cartwright, a girl on the cusp of her own life, turned the corner onto Elm Street, her footsteps a steady, rhythmic beat on the damp sidewalk, a sound that was about to be abruptly and permanently silenced. In the vast, uncaring calculus of the universe, her life was about to become a statistical anomaly, a case file, a ghost that would haunt the quiet, tree-lined streets of her hometown for decades to come, a monument to the chilling truth that the most terrifying monsters are not the ones that hide in the woods, but the ones who walk among us, smiling and saying hello, their normalcy the most terrifying mask of all. The equilibrium of not just a family, but an entire community was about to be shattered, the pieces scattered by a single unseen act of violence that would leave a wound so deep and so clean, it would take nearly 30 years for the bleeding to finally, belatedly, begin. The journey from that crisp November evening to the day of reckoning would be a slow, grinding odyssey through the landscapes of grief, the labyrinth of investigative dead ends, and the patient, waiting world of forensic science, a world that was, in 1992, still slumbering in its infancy, unaware of the profound and terrible secrets it would one day be called upon to unlock from the smallest, most insignificant traces of the lost. The story of Amelia Cartwright's disappearance is not just the story of a crime, but the story of time itself, of its cruel, relentless passage, and its ultimate, surprising capacity to hold a single, microscopic key to a truth long thought to be buried forever. It all began on that walk home, a walk into a darkness far deeper than the simple setting of the sun. The house on Elm Street was a small, well-kept colonial, its blue paint a cheerful defiance against the somber palette of late autumn. Inside, Sarah Cartwright, a woman whose world was defined by the steady, predictable orbits of her husband and 2 children, moved with practiced efficiency in her small kitchen. The air was thick and savory with the smell of the simmering stew, a scent that for the rest of her life would be inextricably linked to the onset of a dread so profound it would fundamentally alter her at a cellular level. Her husband, Robert, a quiet man who worked as an accountant in the next town over, was due home at 6. Her youngest, 12-year-old Leo, was in his room, the muffled sounds of a video game a familiar, comforting part of the domestic soundscape. Only Amy was missing from the equation, a temporary variable soon to be solved by the sound of her key in the lock. At 5:15, Sarah glanced at the clock, a slight, almost imperceptible frown line forming between her brows. Amy was usually home by 5:10, her punctuality a family joke. Sarah stirred the stew, the rhythmic scrape of the wooden spoon against the pot a counterpoint to her own quickening heartbeat. She walked to the front window and peered out into the deepening twilight. The street was empty, bathed in the lonely orange glow of the streetlights. A gust of wind sent a cascade of brown leaves skittering across the pavement like a host of tiny, frantic ghosts. This was the first of the if-onlys, the small, seemingly insignificant moments that would later be magnified under the cruel lens of hindsight and replayed in an endless loop in the theater of Sarah's mind for the next 30 years. If only she had insisted on picking Amy up. The library was only a short walk, and Amy, in her fierce, quiet teenage independence, had scoffed at the offer, saying she enjoyed the walk, the chance to clear her head. It was a reasonable, logical decision, the kind made 1,000 times a day in safe, quiet towns like Havenwood, but it was a decision that would unravel their world. By 5:30, the frown line had become a permanent trench. The low hum of anxiety had escalated into a shrill, insistent alarm. She called the library. Mrs. Gable, her voice full of grandmotherly concern, confirmed that Amy had left promptly at 5. "She seemed fine, Sarah," Mrs. Gable had said, a statement of such profound and terrible irony. "Just her usual sweet self." Sarah then called the homes of Amy's 2 closest friends, her voice tight, artificially calm, not wanting to spread an alarm that she prayed was a false one. Neither had seen her, neither had heard from her. The calm began to fray, the carefully constructed facade of a normal Tuesday evening starting to crack and splinter. At 6 o'clock, Robert Cartwright pulled his sedan into the driveway. He walked in, shrugging off his coat, the scent of the cold, damp air clinging to him. He saw the look on his wife's face, the untouched dinner table, the pot of stew now turned down to the lowest possible heat, and he knew. Before a single word was spoken, he knew that the fundamental laws of his universe had been broken. The call to the Havenwood Police Department was logged at 6:17 p.m., a clinical, emotionless entry in a ledger filled with the town's minor transgressions, a fender bender on Main Street, a complaint about a barking dog, a report of teenagers loitering behind the convenience store. But this call was different. It was a tear in the fabric of the town's mundane reality, the first sign of a cancer that was about to metastasize through the heart of the community. The dispatcher, a woman who knew the Cartwrights from the church bake sale, tried to be reassuring, speaking the standard hollow words of comfort. "It's only been an hour, Sarah. Teenagers, you know how they are." She probably just stopped to talk to a friend. But Sarah Cartwright, in the grip of a primal maternal certainty that transcended logic, knew that this was not the case. Something was wrong. Something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. Her daughter, the steady, reliable center of her world, had vanished somewhere in the 12-minute walk between the library and her own front door. She had stepped out of the warm yellow light and into a cold, waiting darkness, and the world had simply, silently swallowed her whole. The initial response from the Havenwood PD was measured, professional, yet tinged with the same underlying belief that this was likely a teenage misunderstanding, a minor drama that would resolve itself by morning. The officer dispatched to the Cartwright home was a young patrolman, not much older than Amy herself, his face a mask of practiced solemnity that couldn't quite hide his inexperience. He took down the details. Amelia Cartwright, female, Caucasian, 17 years of age, 5'6", 120 pounds, last seen wearing a denim jacket, blue jeans, and carrying a canvas tote bag, a description that could match 1,000 girls in 1,000 small towns across America. But as the hours ticked by, as 9 o'clock became 10, and then 11, the initial calm began to erode, replaced by the grim, creeping tendrils of a more sinister possibility. Detective Frank Miller was called at home just before midnight. A 20-year veteran of the force, Miller was a man whose methodical, plodding nature was often mistaken for a lack of imagination. In reality, he was a human archive of the town's secrets, a man who understood that true evil was often banal, its face not that of a monster, but of a neighbor. He arrived at the Cartwright house to find a scene of quiet, suspended horror. The stew on the stove had long gone cold. Robert Cartwright sat in his armchair, staring at a fixed point on the wall, his silence more profound than any scream. Leo was huddled on the stairs, a small, forgotten spectator to a tragedy he was too young to comprehend, and Sarah Cartwright was pacing, a caged animal of a woman, her mind already working, already calculating, her grief momentarily subsumed by the fierce, burning need for action. Miller, with his weary eyes and the faint scent of stale coffee that seemed to perpetually cling to him, listened patiently, his presence a heavy, calming anchor in the storm of their panic. He recognized immediately what the younger officers had missed, the sheer, unblemished normalcy of it all. There was no note, there was no history of rebellion, there was no sign of a planned departure. Amy's room was a perfect, undisturbed diorama of a teenage girl's life, a half-finished novel on her bedside table, a concert ticket for a band she now idolized, tacked to her corkboard, a pile of homework on her desk. This was not a runaway. This was an abduction. Miller's first action was to walk the route himself, from the library to the house, his heavy flashlight cutting a lonely swath through the cold, damp dark. The 12-minute walk. He measured it. He studied it. The street was a corridor of old, sleeping houses, their windows dark eyes in the night. It was a place of perceived safety, a place where parents let their children walk home after dark without a second thought. And it was this very safety, he realized, that made it so dangerous. It bred complacency. It lowered its guard. Somewhere along this short, familiar stretch of sidewalk, a predator had found an opportunity that lasted no more than a few seconds. A car door opening, a hand reaching out, a voice speaking a familiar name. It would have been quiet. It would have been fast. The investigation began in earnest as the cold, grey light of Wednesday morning broke over Havenwood. The news, which had been a whispered rumor the night before, was now a confirmed, terrifying fact, spreading through the town like a contagion. Amy Cartwright was missing. The words seemed impossible. A headline from a big city newspaper that had no place in their quiet, orderly world. The police station became the nerve center of a frantic, burgeoning operation. Miller, working on no sleep, began to coordinate the search. He requested assistance from the state police, their crisp, professional uniforms, a stark contrast to the small-town feel of his own department. Topographical maps were unrolled, search grids were drawn, and the first of what would become hundreds of volunteers began to assemble at the town hall, their faces a mixture of fear, concern, and a grim, neighborly resolve. They were teachers and farmers, and shopkeepers, ordinary people drawn together by an extraordinary tragedy. They fanned out through the woods that bordered the town, their bright orange vests stark against the grey-brown of the November landscape, their calls of "Amy," a hopeful, futile prayer against the indifferent silence of the trees. The investigation, meanwhile, followed the grim, predictable logic of such cases. Miller and his team started with the inner circle, the people who knew Amy best. Her friends were interviewed, their tearful, terrified accounts offering little more than a portrait of a happy, well-adjusted girl with no known enemies. Her boyfriend, a nervous, pimply-faced boy from the high school football team, was questioned for hours. His alibi, at home with his parents, eventually checking out, though not before he had endured the terrifying, soul-stripping ordeal of being the primary suspect in the disappearance of the girl he loved. They looked at known sex offenders in the county, a small, pathetic list of men whose own sad, broken lives were now under the harsh glare of official scrutiny. They looked at transients, at strangers, at anyone who did not fit into the neat, predictable tapestry of Havenwood society. But every lead was a dead end. Every interview was a closed door. It was as if Amy had simply been erased, plucked from the world with a terrifying, surgical precision that left no clues, no witnesses, and no answers. Amidst the chaos of the search, a quiet, unassuming figure emerged as a pillar of the community's response. Alistair Finch, the owner of Finch's Hardware, a man who had lived in Havenwood his entire life, was at the town hall every morning, handing out coffee and donuts to the volunteers. He was in his late 40s, a bachelor, with a gentle, almost timid demeanor and kind eyes that seemed to reflect the town's collective grief. He offered Robert Cartwright a firm, sympathetic handshake. He told Sarah that the entire town was praying for them. He even joined one of the search parties himself, his face a mask of grim determination as he beat his way through the dense underbrush of the state park. He was a good neighbor, a concerned citizen, a man who was, by all appearances, as horrified and bewildered by the tragedy as everyone else. No one, not Detective Miller, not Sarah Cartwright, not a single soul in that grief-stricken town, could have possibly imagined that the hands that offered them coffee were the same hands that had sealed Amy's fate. The monster they were all searching for was not some shadowy outsider, some faceless drifter. He was standing, right there beside them, his heart beating a calm, steady rhythm, his terrible secret hidden behind the most impenetrable disguise of all, a lifetime of absolute, unimpeachable normalcy. The first 72 hours, the most critical window in any missing person case, passed in a blur of frantic activity and diminishing hope. The search of the woods yielded nothing but sore feet and a deepening sense of despair. The canvassing of Elm Street produced no witnesses. No one had seen a strange car. No one had heard a scream. The quiet tree-lined street had kept its terrible secret. By the weekend, the state police began to scale back their involvement. The media, which had descended on the town in a frenzy, began to pack up their vans, their attention already drifting towards the next tragedy, the next headline. The number of volunteers dwindled, the reality of their own lives, their jobs and their families, pulling them away from the search. For the Cartwrights, this was the beginning of a new, more terrible phase of their ordeal. The initial, adrenaline-fueled panic of the search was replaced by the slow, grinding and hollow ache of the unknown. The question of "Where is Amy?" was slowly, cruelly, being replaced by the unendurable question of, is she alive? Detective Miller, however, did not let go. The case had gotten under his skin. It had become personal. He would spend his nights in the office, long after the other officers had gone home, staring at the growing pile of files on his desk, at the smiling, hopeful face of Amy Cartwright pinned to the corkboard. He went over every interview, every timeline, every dead-end lead, searching for the one tiny detail he must have missed. The dropped book, a paperback copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, found by a search volunteer on the grassy verge of Elm Street, just 50 yards from Amy's house, was their only piece of physical evidence. It was Amy's, confirmed by a library stamp and a small doodled heart in the margin. The area was scoured, but nothing else was found. In 1992, the science of DNA was still in its relative infancy. The book was dusted for fingerprints, but the prints were smudged, useless. A forensic team had swabbed the cover for trace evidence, for fibers, for anything. They found a few microscopic traces of material, things that were duly collected, bagged, and labeled, but which told them nothing with the technology of the day. The book was a tantalizing, heartbreaking clue, a final, silent word from Amy that only deepened the mystery. It suggested the abduction had happened right there, almost within sight of her own front door. It suggested a struggle, a brief, desperate moment of resistance, but it offered no path forward. The case had hit a wall, a solid, unbreachable barrier of silence and absence. For Frank Miller, it was a professional nightmare. For the Cartwrights, it was the beginning of a life sentence, a purgatory of unanswered questions and unending grief, a life lived in the long, cold shadow of a 12-minute walk on a Tuesday afternoon in November. The first year after Amy's disappearance was a year of suspended animation for the Cartwright family. The world moved on, the seasons turned, but their lives remained frozen in that last, terrible moment of normalcy. The blue-shuttered house on Elm Street became a monument to loss, a place of profound and suffocating silence. Amy's room was left untouched, a perfect, heartbreaking museum of a life interrupted. Her books sat on the shelf, her clothes hung in the closet, a fine layer of dust gathering on the surfaces, the only tangible evidence of the passage of time. Sarah Cartwright, once a woman of gentle routines, became a warrior. Her grief, a force of nature too powerful to be contained, was channeled into a relentless, obsessive quest for answers. She spent her days at the library, not as a mother waiting for her daughter, but as a detective, poring over old newspapers, searching for reports of similar incidents, for any pattern, any clue that the police might have missed. She became a fixture at the police station, her presence a constant, quiet reproach to the other officers, a living reminder of their failure. She and Detective Miller formed an unlikely, unspoken alliance, two souls bound together by a shared, haunting obsession. Robert Cartwright, in contrast, retreated into himself. His grief was a quiet, corrosive thing, eating him away from the inside. He went to work, he came home, he moved through the shell of his life like a ghost, his eyes holding a permanent, distant sorrow. The shared language of his marriage, the small intimacies and easy comforts, had been replaced by the single, unspeakable topic of their missing daughter. They were two people trapped on the same desolate island, but they had forgotten how to speak to each other. For Leo, growing up in the shadow of his sister's absence was a strange and confusing ordeal. He was the forgotten victim, the living child in a house of mourning. His own childhood milestones, his birthdays, his school achievements were muted, joyless affairs, always overshadowed by the ghost of his sister. He learned to be quiet, to be self-sufficient, to not cause any trouble, to not add to the burden of his parents' grief. He was growing up in a home where the air itself was made of sadness. The town of Havenwood, too, was changed. The easy, unlocked door sense of security was gone, replaced by a new, subtle undercurrent of fear and suspicion. Parents who had once let their children roam free now watched them with a hawk-like vigilance. Strangers were viewed with a new, instinctive distrust. The disappearance of Amy Cartwright had been a stone thrown into the placid pond of their community, and the ripples of that impact were spreading, altering the very nature of the place they called home. Every year, on November 10th, Sarah would organize a candlelight vigil at the town square. It was a solemn, heartbreaking ritual. The same faces would appear each year, their numbers dwindling slightly with the passage of time, their faces etched with a few more lines. Detective Miller always came, even after his retirement, standing at the back of the crowd, a silent, stooped figure in the cold. Alistair Finch was always there too, his hardware store closing early for the occasion, his expression one of perfect, practiced sorrow. He would offer a quiet word of comfort to Sarah, a gesture of such profound, monstrous hypocrisy that it defied comprehension. He was watching a community mourn a crime that he alone had the power to solve. He was a god in his own small, sick universe, the sole keeper of a terrible, intoxicating secret. The case file for Amelia Cartwright Cartwright grew thicker with each passing year, a dense paper tombstone filled with dead-end leads, speculative theories, and the fading hopes of a dozen different detectives who had inherited the case after Miller's retirement. It became the Havenwood mystery, a piece of local folklore, a ghost story told to frighten teenagers. The actual girl, the living, breathing, poetry-loving Amy, was fading, replaced by the myth of her own disappearance. In 1999, 7 years after Amy vanished, Detective Miller finally retired. On his last day, he packed up his desk but left the Cartwright file open, a symbolic gesture to the young detective who would be his successor. "Don't let her be forgotten," was all he said, his voice thick with a weariness that went far beyond the job. The file was his ghost, the one great failure of a long and decorated career. It would haunt him to his dying day. The physical evidence, what little there was of it, was packaged into a cardboard box, labeled Cartwright, Amelia, and consigned to the evidence locker, a climate-controlled crypt in the basement of the county courthouse. Inside, the copy of To Kill a Mockingbird sat in a sealed plastic bag. The microscopic fibers, the invisible traces of the killer, lay dormant on its cover, a silent, sleeping army of witnesses waiting for a technology that did not yet exist. In 2002, the 10-year anniversary was marked by a lengthy article in the regional newspaper. The article featured a new photograph of the Cartwrights. Sarah, her hair now streaked with grey, her face a mask of fierce, unyielding determination. Robert, looking 20 years older than his age, his eyes hollow. And Leo, a young man now, standing slightly apart from his parents, his expression a complex mixture of sorrow and a desperate desire to escape the suffocating gravity of his family's tragedy. That same year, a major technological breakthrough was occurring in forensic labs across the country. The establishment of the Combined DNA Index System, or CODIS. For the first time, law enforcement had a national database to compare DNA profiles from crime scenes against a growing list of convicted offenders. For thousands of cold cases, it was a sudden, miraculous dawn after a long, dark night. The Cartwright case, however, remained in the dark. The trace evidence from the book was re-examined, and a tiny partial DNA profile was successfully extracted from a microscopic skin cell left behind by the unknown assailant. It was a stunning achievement of the new science. The profile was uploaded to CODIS, a digital message in a bottle cast into a vast electronic sea. But there was no hit. The killer, the man who had taken Amy Cartwright, had never been arrested for another crime. He had no criminal record. He was not in the system. The one great hope of the new century had, for the Cartwright case, led to another dead end. The digital wall was just as impenetrable as the physical one had been. For Sarah Cartwright, the news was a devastating blow. It was as if she had been offered a lifeline, only to have it snatched away at the last moment. But her resolve did not break. If science could not give her the answer, she would continue to search for it herself. She became a prominent voice in the growing national movement for the rights of victims and families of the missing, her own personal tragedy a powerful, galvanizing force for change. She had lost her daughter, but she had found a new, terrible purpose: to be a voice for the forgotten, to ensure that no other family would have to endure the silent, unending agony that had become the defining feature of her own life. The years continued to turn. The world changed. The 20th century gave way to the 21st. Havenwood saw new developments, new families moving in, people who had no memory of the girl who had vanished on Elm Street. The case grew colder, the trail fainter, the hope of a resolution all but extinguished. It had become one of the thousands of unsolved mysteries that litter the landscape of American crime. A sad story, a cautionary tale, a file destined to gather dust in a forgotten corner of a police station basement. But the microscopic witnesses, the silent traces of the killer's DNA, were still waiting patiently in their evidence bag. Their story was not over. They were simply waiting for the science to evolve one more time, waiting for a new generation of investigators who could speak their language, who could finally force them to give up the name of the man who had walked away from Elm Street on that cold November night, leaving a universe of pain and silence in his wake. In 2018, 26 years after Amy's disappearance, a new directive came down from the New York State Attorney General's office. A portion of a state budget surplus was to be allocated to the formation of dedicated cold case units in several counties, including the one that encompassed Havenwood. The initiative was a recognition of the vast, untapped potential of modern forensic science to solve the crimes of the past. It was a lifeline thrown to the forgotten victims and their long-suffering families. The newly formed Havenwood County Cold Case Unit was a small, unassuming operation housed in a cramped, windowless office in the basement of the courthouse, not far from the evidence locker itself. It was staffed by a handful of semi-retired detectives and one young, ambitious investigator who had specifically requested the assignment. Her name was Isabella Rossi. Detective Rossi was everything Frank Miller had not been. Where he had been a product of shoe-leather detective work and gut instinct, she was a product of the digital age. She held a master's degree in forensic science and saw the world through the cool, clear lens of data and probability. She was fluent in the arcane languages of YSTR analysis, mitochondrial DNA, and the burgeoning revolutionary field of investigative genetic genealogy. To her, a cold case file was not a tombstone. It was a data set filled with hidden patterns and undiscovered correlations, waiting for the right algorithm, the right analytical tool to unlock its secrets. When she was given her first caseload, the thick, dusty file of the Amelia Cartwright case was sitting on top. It was the county's most famous, most tragic, and most stubbornly unsolved mystery. For Rossi, it was not just a case. It was a challenge, a mountain to be climbed. Her first step was not to re-interview the old witnesses, but to re-examine the old evidence. She spent a week in the evidence locker, a sterile, silent world of cardboard boxes and faded labels. She carefully, methodically, went through every item in the Cartwright box: the photographs, the witness statements, the old handwritten notes of Detective Miller, his frustration and obsession palpable even after all these years. And then she came to the sealed bag containing the paperback book. She knew from the file that a partial DNA profile had been extracted from it years ago, a profile that had yielded no matches in CODIS. But science had advanced. The ability to extract and amplify tiny, degraded samples of DNA had improved by orders of magnitude. And more importantly, a new door had opened, a controversial, powerful, and game-changing door: the use of public, direct-to-consumer DNA databases to identify suspects through their family members. Rossi's first official action on the Cartwright case was to submit a formal request to send the swab from the book to a specialized private lab, a lab that was at the forefront of genetic genealogy. It was a long shot. The sample was almost 3 decades old. It might be too degraded. Even if they got a full profile, it might not yield any familial matches in the public databases. But it was a chance. It was the one single thread of physical evidence that connected the present to that terrible, silent moment on Elm Street in 1992. While she waited for the results from the lab, Rossi made a visit. She drove to the blue-shuttered house on Elm Street. The paint was a little more faded, the trees a little taller, but otherwise it was the same. She knocked on the door, and it was answered by a woman in her late 60s, her hair almost entirely white, her eyes holding a familiar, weary fire. It was Sarah Cartwright. Rossi had expected to meet a broken woman, a victim consumed by her grief. But Sarah was something else. She was a general, a commander in a war that had lasted for more than half her life. She welcomed Rossi into her home, into the living room that was a shrine to her lost daughter. She spoke about Amy not in the past tense, but in the present, as if she were just in the other room. She laid out her own vast, independent investigation, her files and notebooks as thick and as detailed as the official police file. She was not a grieving mother asking for help. She was a fellow investigator presenting her findings. There was an immediate, unspoken bond between the two women, the old warrior and the young scientist, the mother who refused to let her daughter's memory die, and the detective who believed that science could make the dead speak. Rossi didn't make any promises. She knew the long odds. She knew the history of false dawns and dead ends in this case. But as she left the house, she felt a new, profound sense of purpose. She was not just trying to solve a puzzle. She was trying to bring a measure of peace to a woman who had not known a single peaceful day in 26 years. She was fighting not just for Amy, but for Sarah. The wait for the lab results was agonizing, a period of weeks that stretched into months. For the first time, Rossi began to understand the slow, grinding torment that had defined the lives of the Cartwrights and Detective Miller, the waiting, the hoping, the crushing silence. Then, one Tuesday morning in the spring of 2019, an email arrived in her inbox. The subject line contained only the case number for the Cartwright investigation. Rossi's heart hammered in her chest. She opened the email. The lab had been successful. They had managed to extract a full, viable DNA profile from the microscopic skin cells left on the book cover nearly 3 decades earlier. It was a 1 in a trillion miracle of modern science. The first battle had been won, but the war was far from over. The profile was now in the hands of a team of forensic genealogists, the new high priests of cold case investigation. Their task was to upload the killer's genetic blueprint to the public databases, sites like GED Match and Family Tree DNA, where millions of ordinary people had voluntarily shared their own DNA in the hope of finding long-lost relatives or exploring their ancestry. The killer himself would almost certainly not be in the database, but a cousin, a great aunt, a distant ancestor might be, and from that one tiny familial link, a family tree could be built. It was a painstaking, laborious process, a form of reverse engineering a human life, starting from a single, anonymous data point. The genealogists, a small team of dedicated, obsessive researchers, began their work. They uploaded the profile, and they waited. For weeks, there was nothing. The killer, it seemed, was a ghost in the genetic machine as well, his family line as elusive as he was. But then, a match, not a close one, but a match nonetheless. A man in Oregon who shared a small but significant segment of DNA with the unknown subject. He was identified as a potential third cousin. It was the break they had been waiting for, the first faint light after 30 years of darkness. The work that followed was a masterclass in forensic deduction. Using census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries, the genealogists began to build a family tree, starting with the third cousin in Oregon and working their way back in time. They were searching for the set of great-great-grandparents that he shared with the killer. It was a journey into the dusty, forgotten archives of American history, a search for a single, common ancestor from whom two divergent family lines had sprung. After weeks of relentless, meticulous work, they found them, a farming couple who had lived in upstate New York in the late 19th century. This was the genetic headwaters of their investigation. Now the work reversed. They had to trace every single one of that couple's descendants forward in time, building a vast, sprawling family tree that encompassed hundreds of individuals across 5 generations. They were hunting for a single branch of that tree, a branch that had to meet a specific set of criteria. They were looking for a male who would have been of the right age to commit the crime in 1992 and who, most critically, had lived in or near Havenwood, New York, at the time of Amy's disappearance. The tree grew, its branches spreading out across the country. One branch led to a family in California, another to a line of descendants in Florida. And then they found it, a branch of the family that had never left the Hudson Valley, a branch that had settled in Havenwood in the early 20th century. The genealogists' hearts began to beat faster. They were close. The names on this branch of the tree were cross-referenced with local records, with old phone books, with property deeds, and then a single name emerged, a name that caused the lead genealogist to push her chair back from her desk and take a deep, shuddering breath. A man who fit the profile perfectly, a man who was the right age, a man who had lived his entire life in Havenwood, a man whose hardware store was a landmark on Main Street, a man who had handed out coffee to the search parties, a man who had offered his condolences to the grieving parents. Alistair Finch. The name landed on Detective Rossi's desk like a grenade. The report was clinical, detached, a simple statement of genealogical probability. But the implications were earth-shattering. It couldn't be him, the gentle, kind, slightly eccentric Mr. Finch, the man who gave candy to children on Halloween and sponsored the local Little League team. It was impossible. It defied every law of logic and human nature. But the science was undeniable. The cold, hard, and unforgiving logic of the DNA pointed to only one conclusion. Alistair Finch was not just a suspect. He was, with an almost statistical certainty, the man who had left his DNA on the book that Amelia Cartwright had dropped in her final, desperate moments of freedom. The investigation now entered its most delicate and critical phase. The genealogical evidence, while powerful, was not enough on its own for an arrest. It was an investigative lead, not a smoking gun. They needed a direct, confirmatory DNA sample from Finch himself, a sample that could be matched one-to-one with the profile from the crime scene. And they needed to obtain it without alerting him, without giving the quiet, unassuming monster the chance to run or to destroy any other evidence he might have kept for 30 years. A covert surveillance operation was launched. For 2 weeks, a team of plainclothes officers monitored Alistair Finch's every move. What they saw was a life of profound, almost chilling normalcy. He opened his hardware store at 8 in the morning. He sold nails and paint and gardening supplies, making small talk with his customers, the same people he had known his entire life. He ate a sandwich for lunch at the same small cafe every day. He closed his store at 6, drove his modest, well-maintained pickup truck home to the small, tidy house he had inherited from his parents, and spent his evenings watching television or working in his woodshop. There was no sign of a secret life, no hint of a dark side. He was the very picture of a quiet, harmless, small-town bachelor. His placid, predictable routine was, in its own way, more terrifying than any overt act of monstrousness. It spoke of a capacity for compartmentalization, a level of self-control that was truly sociopathic. He had committed a terrible, soul-destroying crime, and had then simply gone on with his life, the secret locked away in some deep, cold, and inaccessible part of his mind. The opportunity to obtain his DNA came on a Thursday morning. Finch, following his unvarying routine, bought a coffee from the local donut shop. He drank it in his truck, parked in his usual spot behind the hardware store, before starting his day. He then tossed the empty paper cup into a public trash can. It was the moment the surveillance team had been waiting for. As soon as Finch was inside the store, an officer, disguised as a sanitation worker, retrieved the cup. It was carefully bagged, labeled, and rushed to the state crime lab. The wait for the results was the most tense period of the entire 30-year investigation. Everything hinged on the microscopic saliva cells left on the rim of that coffee cup. If it was a match, the ghost that had haunted Havenwood for a generation would finally have a face. If it was not, they were back to square one. Their best lead, their only lead, turned to smoke. 48 hours later, the call came. Detective Rossi was in her office, staring at the smiling face of Amy Cartwright, the same photo that had been pinned to Frank Miller's corkboard all those years ago. The voice of the lab technician on the other end of the line was calm, professional, but Rossi could hear the undercurrent of excitement. "Detective," he said, "we have a match. It's a perfect one-to-one match to the profile from the Cartwright evidence. There is no question. Your suspect is the source." Rossi closed her eyes. A wave of profound, bone-deep relief washed over her, so powerful it almost brought her to her knees. They had him. After 30 years of silence, after a generation of pain and uncertainty, they finally had him. The ghost of Elm Street had a name, and his name was Alistair Finch. The arrest was planned with a quiet, strategic precision. There would be no sirens, no dramatic high-speed chase. They would take him in a way that mirrored his own quiet, unassuming evil. On the morning of Tuesday, May 21, 2019, almost 27 years to the day after Amy's disappearance, Detective Isabella Rossi, accompanied by 2 other plainclothes officers, walked into Finch's hardware. The small bell above the door chimed, the same sound it had made a million times before. Alistair Finch was behind the counter, arranging a display of paintbrushes. He looked up, a placid, welcoming smile on his face. "Morning, Detective," he said, his voice calm, friendly. He knew who Rossi was. In a town the size of Havenwood, everyone knew everyone. "What can I get for you today?" Rossi walked up to the counter. She looked into the kind, gentle eyes of the man the entire town had trusted for 50 years. She saw nothing there. No fear, no surprise, only a flat, empty, and chilling impassivity. "Alistair Finch," she said, her own voice steady, colder than she had ever heard it. "You are under arrest for the kidnapping and murder of Amelia Cartwright." The smile did not falter. The light in his eyes did not change. He simply placed the paintbrush he was holding back onto the display, his movements slow, deliberate. "I see," he said, his voice a quiet, conversational whisper. "I suppose it was only a matter of time." He turned, placed his hands behind his back, and allowed the officers to cuff him without a word of protest, without a flicker of emotion. It was not a confession of guilt. It was an acknowledgement of a game that had finally, after 3 decades, come to an end. The news of the arrest hit Havenwood like a seismic shockwave. It was not just news, it was a fundamental violation of the town's own narrative. Alistair Finch? Kind? Gentle Mr. Finch? It was impossible. It was a mistake. The initial reaction was one of fierce, protective denial. People who had known him their entire lives, who had bought their children's first bicycles from him, who had sought his advice on lawn care, refused to believe it. He was a part of the town's foundation, a piece of the landscape. But the denial quickly crumbled in the face of the undeniable scientific certainty of the DNA evidence. And the denial was replaced by something far worse, a profound, collective sense of betrayal. The monster had not come from outside. He had been born and raised among them. He had been a part of their lives. Every act of kindness he had ever shown, every friendly wave, every quiet conversation, was now recast in a new, monstrous light. The town was forced to confront the terrible truth that they had not known him at all. They had only known the mask. The interrogation of Alistair Finch was a quiet, surreal affair. He sat in the sterile interview room, his hands cuffed in front of him, and he talked. His confession was delivered in the same flat, emotionless tone he used to discuss the price of lumber. There was no remorse. There was no passion. There was only a calm, factual recitation of the events of November 10th, 1992. He had seen Amy walking home. He knew her, of course. She was a sweet girl who sometimes came into the store with her father. He had felt an impulse, he said, a sudden, quiet desire for control. He had pulled his truck over, offered her a ride. She knew him, trusted him. She had gotten in. That was all it had taken. A single, small act of trust, tragically misplaced. He drove her not to her home, but to a remote, abandoned hunting cabin his family had owned deep in the Catskill Mountains, a place no one had used in years. What happened there, he described with a chilling, clinical detachment that turned the blood of the seasoned detectives cold. And then he told them where she was. He had buried her in a shallow grave deep in the woods behind the cabin, beneath a distinctive, lightning-scarred oak tree. He gave them precise, clear directions, the memory as fresh and as accessible as if it had happened yesterday. For 30 years, he had carried that map in his head, a secret, terrible piece of personal geography. The call to Sarah Cartwright was the hardest and most important call of Detective Rossi's career. She drove to the house on Elm Street herself. She sat with Sarah and her now adult Leo in the quiet living room, the same room where the vigil had begun 3 decades earlier, and she told them they had found the man, she told them he had confessed, and she told them that they were finally going to bring Amy home. There were no shouts of triumph, there was no cry for vengeance, there was only a profound, shuddering, and soul-deep silence as the weight of 30 years of uncertainty finally, crushingly, came to an end. The tears that Sarah Cartwright shed were not tears of joy, but of a grief so vast and so ancient that it had almost forgotten how to express itself. It was the end of the fight, the end of the war. It was not victory, it was just the end. The recovery of Amelia Cartwright's remains was a solemn, painstaking process. A team of forensic anthropologists, led by Detective Rossi and a local sheriff, followed the map provided by a monster, a map drawn from a 30-year-old memory. They found the lightning-scarred oak tree, and beneath it, they found her. They were able to bring her home. The town of Havenwood, its innocence shattered, its trust in its own foundations broken, held a funeral for a girl who had been missing for almost 3 decades. The entire town came, their faces a mixture of sorrow for the girl they had lost, and a new, terrible shame for the monster they had unknowingly harbored. Sarah and Leo Cartwright stood at the graveside, 2 solitary figures who had finally been released from the purgatory of the unknown, only to be delivered into the final, grim reality of their loss. It was not closure. There is no such thing as closure for a wound so deep, but it was an ending. It was an answer. It was a name for the grave. A few weeks later, a letter arrived at the Havenwood police station. It was addressed to Detective Rossi. It was from the hospice where Frank Miller, the weary detective who had first caught the case, was spending his final days. His health had been failing for years, his body finally succumbing to a lifetime of long hours and cold coffee. A nurse had read him the news of the arrest, of the confession. According to her letter, a small, faint smile had touched the old detective's lips. He had closed his eyes, and a few hours later, he had passed away. His ghost had finally been laid to rest. Alistair Finch pleaded guilty, his plea saving the Cartwrights and the town from the trauma of a long public trial. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would die in a cage, a quiet, forgotten old man in a grey uniform, the monster finally stripped of his mask of normalcy. He never offered an explanation. He never expressed a single word of remorse. His motive, his inner world, remained a locked room, the key thrown away. The story of Amelia Cartwright is a tragedy, a testament to the fragility of life and the capacity for a darkness to hide in the most ordinary of places. But it is also a story of resilience, the resilience of a mother who refused to give up, whose love for her daughter became a burning, unquenchable fire that lit the way for 30 years. And it is a story of the quiet, patient power of science, of the microscopic witnesses who held their secret until the world was finally ready to listen. In the Havenwood Cemetery, there is a simple granite headstone. It reads, Amelia Cartwright, beloved daughter and sister. Her story is finally home. The case file is closed. The ghost of Elm Street has been laid to rest. But for the town of Havenwood, the chill of that November evening in 1992 will never entirely fade. It is a permanent part of their history, a reminder that the equilibrium of our lives is a fragile, precious thing, and that the walk home is never, ever guaranteed. The search for answers in cases like these is a marathon of hope against the crushing weight of time, a testament to the investigators and families who refuse to let the forgotten stay lost. Their dedication changes the course of history, one cold case at a time. For more stories of justice, science, and the relentless pursuit of truth, we encourage you to follow our channel, where the work of remembering continues, ensuring that no victim is ever truly erased by the silence.